Have you ever heard of Kong? Revenge of the Remakes. King Kong. And welcome back to Colby's Nerd Talks. I know I was gone a week, I'm sorry for that, but I was moving. As you can see, new setup. And I thought I would kick off my return to YouTube with a very special installment of Revenge of the Remakes. And what better movie to kick off my new adventure here than with one of the best adventure movies ever made. Kong, the eighth wonder of the world! So as you may or may not know, King Kong is a massive franchise that's had remakes, it's had spin-offs, reinterpretations, sequels, video game adaptations, maybe? Do your own research on that one. It's a pretty fun court case. And it makes sense. King Kong is a quintessential giant ape movie, and to be fair, it is a very special effects driven movie, and it's cool to see King Kong brought to life with different technology. But for the purposes of this video, I'm only going to be talking about the main 3 remakes that we've gotten, the ones that are actually titled King Kong. You have Merian C. Cooper's original 1933 King Kong, Dino DeLaurentis' 1976 King Kong, and of course, Peter Jackson's 2005 King Kong. But to really understand what makes these remakes work or not work, we have to first understand what made the original work so well and resonate with so many people, to the point where every generation we've had to remake it. And for me, it comes down to 2 key elements. The first is that King Kong really is a meta-commentary on the film industry of the 1930s. And the second is that it also functions just as well as an exciting adventure story. But let's get the meta-commentary out of the way first, since that is the premise of the movie and it hits you right out of the gate with it. Because from the first scene of the original, they're talking about the film industry and it gets pretty meta, which was pretty rare for movies in those days. So Carl Denham is an eccentric movie director who just really wants to go out into the jungles and film exotic and exciting things. And he comes into possession of a map to an island that has never been discovered by the civilized world. And he wants to get down there and shoot it because he heard about the legend of Kong, which describes a giant beast that wreaks havoc on the jungle and villages of this island, and whom the villagers worship as a god. Now, Denham doesn't necessarily believe this story, but he does believe that there is some beast on this island that no one's ever seen before, and that he needs to photograph. Now, if you know anything about the film industry in the Great Depression, there was a boom of new footage coming out of Hollywood, new types of movies. You had the gangster movie, you had the adventure movie, you had the monster movie. Horror was becoming a really big thing in the 1930s, and audiences ate up anything that thrilled or excited them when they went to the movies. Again, in order to escape the rampant unemployment and starvation that was going on because of the Great Depression. And to that end, directors often sidestepped caution or even just general safety of themselves and their crew in order to get footage of things nobody's ever seen before. In fact, in the movie, Denham even jokes about an incident with a charging rhino where his cinematographer didn't trust him to shoot the rhino before the rhino got him. And you can start to draw parallels between Carl Denham and some of the big directors of the day, like James Whale and Cecil B. DeMille, who often risked actors' safety in order for the shot. And what I find hilarious is that the director that perfectly embodies Carl Denham's attitude throughout this entire movie is Michael Curtiz, a director that's made really every movie under the sun. His filmography is extensive, but you may know him as the director that made Errol Flynn's career in movies like Captain Blood and Robin Hood. And he's become infamous for the amount of times he's put actors in danger for the sake of a movie. And nobody even knew who he was when this movie came out. And not only is this movie a great meta-commentary on the state of Hollywood in the Great Depression, but it also serves as an entertaining and at times even thrilling adventure story in the jungle, akin to something like the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movies that were popular. But what sets this movie apart from the jungle adventure movies of the day is the use of prehistoric animals instead of regular jungle animals. There's no lions or tigers or bears, oh my, in this movie at all. Really, the only thing close to a modern day mammal is Kong himself. But this movie knows exactly how to deliver fast-paced action. And with a runtime of only an hour and 40 minutes, it really takes advantage of this. The film moves at a brisk pace and wastes no time getting you to the island where all the exciting adventure stuff happens. But even before that, the 2 scenes in New York City and the scenes on the boat help to flesh out how these characters fit into 1933 society. You have Carl Denham, played incredibly well by Robert Armstrong, who brings just enough charisma to get these people on the boat, but also just enough crazy eccentric energy to show that This trip is not all on the up and up, but also we're introduced to Bruce Cabot's John Driscoll, who's first mate on the ship and ends up falling in love with Anne Darrow, played by Fay Wray. But anyway, back on the island, the action is given to you fast and frequent. I was kind of surprised watching this again, just how many different monsters they come across in this jungle. Of course, everybody remembers the classic T-Rex fight, and how could you forget it? It's one of the best scenes in the movie, and it's one of the best animated stop-motion fight scenes that I've ever seen. And of course, everyone remembers the classic log confrontation where the search party comes into contact with Kong for the first time. They're on this log, it's staged beautifully, the effects are really good, and I can make an entire separate video just talking about the different versions of this log scene out there, and the Triceratops that may or may not be there. So comment below if you want me to make a separate video on just the log and spider pit sequences, because I think it'd be a lot of fun. And another classic animal confrontation is the Pterodactyls up in Kong's lair, where Kong wrestles with them as John tries to rescue Anne, and they try to escape while Kong's distracted, and it really is a great scene. But there are so many other great animal effects in the confrontations that I personally didn't remember. Like, do you remember the Stegosaurus that charges the group very early on? Or do you remember the Brontosaurus that came out of the water and chased a dude up a tree? Or how about the giant snake that Kong fights in his lair before he fights the Pterodactyls? Or how about the little touch when Driscoll is trapped in the little pocket of the ravine and there's this weird lizard thing crawling up from below? Again, those little touches really serve to keep the energy up and the pace going, to the point where at no point is anyone just walking through the jungle. There's always an animal or a confrontation to keep it exciting. And if you know the story, King Kong follows the two of them back to the village and gets captured by Carl Denham and crew and shipped back to New York City, put on display, again back to the meta commentary. Denham is so blinded by the potential fortune he'll rake in at the box office that he has no idea the kind of danger he's putting New York City in by capturing and displaying Kong. And as the scene plays out, Kong of course gets loose, wreaks all kind of havoc on New York City. So many people die. Kong kidnaps Anne again, takes her to the top of the Empire State Building, fights off some biplanes, and then dies. No, it wasn't the airplanes. It was Beauty killed the beast. First of all, no, it was the airplanes. We just saw it. Second of all, that quote actually has a lot deeper meaning, but I'll talk about that towards the end. So now we understand what made the original such a classic and why it works. So let's see how the remakes do. Now let's talk about the 1976 version of this movie. And quick side story, when I was a little kid, we're talking maybe 4 or 5 years old, this was the first version of King Kong that I ever saw. And it really probably shouldn't have been, because it messed me up. I really didn't like how they handled the climax. It freaked me out. Mostly because it is the most violent and gory of all the King Kong climaxes that I'm going to talk about today, but I'll explain that when I talk about the climax. But the first thing you need to understand about this version of King Kong is that it's not set in 1933. They're making it modern, and by modern, they mean 1976. And what was big in 1976? The oil crisis. So in this case, the whole meta-commentary about the film industry is completely lost, and is replaced by, honestly, a pretty surface-level commentary on the state of the oil industry at the time, which pretty much boils down to we want oil and we want money. So in this version, the Carl Denham substitute is Fred Wilson, an oil tycoon, played by Charles Grodin, who has none of the charisma or the giddy childlike enthusiasm that made Robert Armstrong's portrayal so endearing. And to the end, everybody on the crew just feels like they're risking their lives for a job and for a paycheck rather than doing something creative or innovative or something that they really care about. And the one exception to that on the boat is Jeff Bridges' character, Jack Prescott, who's supposed to be the John Driscoll stand-in. He's a hippie college student from Princeton who snuck aboard this ship to find out about Kong because he's interested in paleontology. So at least he's passionate about discovering something new. And rounding out our cast, instead of Fay Wray, we have Jessica Lange, who is so sexualized in this movie that it's really kind of distracting. Now that's not to say Fay Wray wasn't sexualized in the original at all. I mean, there was that scene where Kong starts to undress her. But in this one, she's so sexualized by the crew and by Kong that it really starts to ask some uncomfortable questions about Kong and his desires and why he likes Dwan so much. Yeah, her name is Dwan. What was wrong with Anne Darrow? Anyone can say it. But no, they named her that because she's an aspiring actress from Beverly Hills that they just found on the open water from a wrecked yacht off the coast of Singapore. That's a stretch and a half. And it's almost like drawn as a live action version of Princess Daphne from Dragon Slayer. You guys remember that? But yeah, there's definitely a lot of strange sexual undertones in this movie that seem to be the point or the message of this movie that really was not the point of the original. Again, the point of the original was supposed to be an adventure film. It's supposed to show Hollywood's arrogance and Hollywood's disregard for safety. But here it really likes to focus on the sexual desires of man, that primal instinctive thing. And when you've got a 25-foot gorilla, it gets pretty gross pretty fast. And now that's not to say anything nasty actually happens in the movie. It is rated PG after all. But it definitely tiptoes that line, and I'm not exactly okay with that. So we haven't even gotten to the island yet, and we've already lost about half of what made the original movie so great. But what about the jungle adventure side? Surely with 70s special effects, the green screen and animatronics and puppetry, we can really make something special from this island. And do they? Not really. Remember how I said a little while ago that it seemed like every scene in the jungle had an encounter with a strange, unique, or prehistoric animal? In this one, there's only 2 encounters with animals, and one of them is with Kong. Of course, you get the classic log scene that, honestly, it looks great in every version. I'm just gonna say that right now. Every version does this log scene justice. Every version really pays their respect to this log scene, and it's no coincidence that this has become one of the classic shots of King Kong. When people think of King Kong, what do they think of? The Empire State Building and him throwing dudes off a log. And in all fairness, the 70s version does do it pretty well. But really, the only other confrontation with any kind of animal is when Kong confronts this giant snake. You remember in the original when there was this little scuffle with a giant snake in Kong's lair? Well, here it's extended into a longer action scene, which ends with a classic fatality that's usually reserved for the T-Rex, where King Kong rips open the beast's jaws and completely destroys it in the process. But here that's reserved for the giant snake, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but snakes can unhook their jaws, right? So even if he did rip off their lower jaw, it wouldn't kill it, right? I don't know, let me know if I'm wrong, but it seems like having that fatality done to a snake kind of defeats the purpose of the fatality, because snakes can unhook their jaws. But that's it as far as animal confrontations on the island. There's no Stegosaurus charge, there's no Brontosaurus in the water, there's no T-Rex fight, the big one that every Kong movie loves to market. It's just the log and the snake, and a lot, and I do mean a lot, of them just walking around in the jungle, talking about oil and ape sexuality, and honestly, I don't remember what else. It just felt like a lot of wasted time. And it's weird that a movie with a runtime of 2 hours and 14 minutes, substantially longer than the original, would have so much less to give us in terms of exciting action scenes. So yeah, the meta commentary is kind of lost in this version, and the jungle excitement and thrill is also kind of lost. So is there anything redeeming about this remake? Actually, yeah, there's a couple things that redeem it. First is that the effects on Kong himself are really good. They got legendary special effects man Rick Baker to come in and be Kong, and it really shows. Now I will say there are a lot of dodgy blue or green screen effects in this movie, and that really does take you out of it. And I would say it's comparable to how the effects in the original have aged, mostly stop motion, some puppetry, but really the original is a stop motion showcase. And while it's really good stop motion, you can tell it's stop motion and it doesn't look that real. So in the same way, the blue screen effects in the 70s version also kind of take you out of the movie. But the look of Kong in the 70s version is by far my favorite look of Kong. And they actually had 2 major techniques for how they did Kong in this movie. The first of which they only used in maybe 3 shots. They actually built a full-scale 25-foot Kong animatronic, full body. And the downside is that it didn't work all that well, and they only used it in 2, maybe 3 shots. And while it really looks fake, you kind of gotta respect him for going all in and building a giant Kong animatronic. But what really impressed me is the ape suit that they made for Rick Baker, and specifically the articulations in the face. It looks really good, and you can get a lot of emotion out of him. I only wish that they did something to make it look less like a guy in a suit and more like an animal. Maybe shorten the legs a little bit, make his posture a little bit less human. I don't know, they could have done a little bit more, but the face is really impressive and holds up so well. So I do give it credit for that. And the other thing that I will, at the end of the day, give as a positive is the climax, which is weird for me saying that because, again, as a kid, that climax wrecked me. And if you don't know how this climax plays out, Kong climbs the World Trade Center, but he climbs all the way to the top, and fights not airplanes, but helicopters, because, modern. But before the helicopters even get there, the army's there, and they go up to the top, and they just light them up with flamethrowers. Like, what are flamethrowers doing in a King Kong movie? That really surprised me as a kid and still startles me today. Because when you think King Kong, you think bullets hitting him, maybe some blood, little blood patches where he got shot, but not entire arm going up in flames and dripping blood. This Climax has some guts. And then when the helicopters do get there and the machine guns start firing, blood going everywhere, bits of fur covered in blood squirting out, it's super gory and really heartbreaking. Because this movie, more than any of the others, make it look like animal cruelty. And I think it's because of the 70s animal rights movement that they're really playing into in this version, that they shoot this climax less like an action scene and more like a horror scene, where this gorilla just gets mauled down by machine gun fire, and by the time he dies, he's just a bloody mess. So strangely enough, the movie that I like the least actually brings the most emotional and tear-jerky climax of all of them. So I really don't know what to say to that. I don't think this is a good adaptation, and as a whole, I don't like it. But it does have some redeeming qualities. So now we've made it to the big one. Peter Jackson's 2005, 3-hour and 7-minute long King Kong. So how did this one do? Well, frankly, it did a lot better than the last one. For one thing, it brought it back to 1933. And being a period piece, it has a lot more opportunities to recapture the magic that is the original King Kong. But for me, the biggest pitfall in this version is its overindulgence. Again, it's 3 hours and 7 minutes long. That's double the runtime of the original. Why does it need to be that long, Peter Jackson? It really doesn't. But I'm getting carried away. Let's talk about how this movie did as a King Kong adaptation. Does this version understand the meta commentary that the original was trying to get across? And does it serve as a fun adventure movie? So let's dive right in. In this version, Carl Denham is back. Same character, same motivation, except this time he's played by Jack Black, who does an okay job. He brings the passion and eccentricity of Carl Denham that Robert Armstrong did, but he also seems to have more of a moral compass than the original did, which kind of shoots him in the foot. Because if you try to make Carl Denham somewhat of a hero, or someone who has heroic traits, it really undercuts the narrative of what unbridled arrogance and passion in a project, without regard to anyone's safety, can lead. So by making Carl Denham more of a respectable guy, it kind of muddies the message a little bit. But he does get the basics of the character right. And the meta-narrative is definitely there. And being made in 2005 and set in 1933, they have a lot more opportunities to make jokes about the film industry of the 1930s, hindsight being 2020. So there's references to Fay Wray, there's references to RKO, there's references to Merian C. Cooper, and those are just the overt references to the original King Kong. There's also references to Cecil B. DeMille and what the producers expect of Jungle Pictures and the desire to put a pretty face in one of them. So all that being said, this version, more so than the original even, takes advantage of commenting on the film industry of the 1930s, which in all likelihood would allow something like King Kong to be displayed on Broadway the way he is in the movie. And this movie actually takes the meta stuff a step further by making Jack Driscoll, the love interest, a writer in this version instead of the first mate, which does offer up some pretty funny meta jokes in a really funny scene where they shoot the movie on the ship, where Ann Darrow and the leading man literally word for word recreate a scene from the original King Kong. So there are some really cool possibilities with this, and it doesn't go unappreciated, especially if you watch all the King Kongs back to back like I did, but this movie takes way too long. I'm not saying have it the same exact length of the original, but at least have it paced like the original. In the original, there were 2 scenes before they got on the ship. In this one, there's a lot of scenes. I lost count. There's just a lot of added backstory and motivation that is useful. I feel like it could have been portrayed in a shorter, more efficient way. And once they're on the ship, things slow down even more. The ship just isn't that interesting a set piece. It's still a ship in the middle of the ocean. You can only make it so interesting. And really about half the runtime is just on the ship, which not only hurts the pacing, but it kind of hurts the jungle adventure side of King Kong. All the different monsters and creatures that they come across on the island. And if you spend a lot of time on the ship, that doesn't leave a lot of time for the island. So let's talk about this island. So the one thing I haven't touched on yet in any of these versions is how they portray the natives to the island. Now, before anyone comments about the political correctness, first of all, I already know. And in all three versions, I don't think they are politically correct. All that being said, this version's natives are pretty ridiculous. Like, they look more like orcs than they do natives. They're just so inhuman looking. You don't really care about these natives because they look like orcs. Like, they straight up look like orcs. I don't know how else to say it. I guess that's what happens when you get the director of Lord of the Rings to do your King Kong movie. But let's get into what we all really wanted to see, the adventure part of Skull Island. We still have a lot of runtime left, and while the beginning and the boat scenes really did eat up a lot of time, we do still have a decent amount of time on Skull Island. So what does it offer us? Well, it offers up a T-Rex fight for one thing, and not just one T-Rex, but 3 T-Rex. Or is it T-Rexes? But anyway, we get a triple T-Rex throwdown with King Kong, and it's exciting. It's a great sequence. It goes on for a bit too long. I think the whole bit where they're tangled in vines is a little too much, and it kind of slows down the pace of the action scene. But when they're all thrown down and King Kong gives that final fatality, rips open the jaw, and I really did like the added touch of him grabbing the tongue with his teeth and ripping it out. It's so brutal and very animalistic, and it gives it a little bit extra touch that the original couldn't do. On top of that, we also get the Brontosaurus from the original, except in this version, he's not in the water. He's actually part of a stampede that's being chased by a bunch of velociraptor-looking dinosaurs. And that scene's exciting, although it is one of the faker-looking sequences, because it gets to a point where the dinosaurs overtake the running crew, and they're forced to hide in between the legs of the Brontosaurus. And for some reason, that always just looked way too fake to me. And that scene also seemed to go on for just a little too long. I think a little tighter editing on Jackson's part really would have brought this together. But you can't forget the classic scene with Kong throwing the dudes off the log and into the spider pit. And yeah, this scene is pretty incredible. Seeing Kong move the log around and guys falling down to their deaths it's always a sight to see, and it's very entertaining. And this version actually has a spider pit scene. None of the other versions had it. The original did have it, but then they cut it because it was too horrifying. But in this version, Peter Jackson takes full advantage of the technology at his disposal and does show us exactly what we wanted to see, but also kind of don't want to see, because it is horrifying and it's disgusting. Seeing these bugs attack these men, only a couple of them survive, and really the worst part for me is this giant leech-looking thing just devour Andy Serkis. If we're going down the Kong monster checklist, the only other confrontation is the Pterodactyls. Although in this version, they replaced Pterodactyls with these smaller, more bat-like flying monsters. It's kind of a mix between a pterodactyl and a bat, but with the face of an orc. Again, there's no denying that Weta, the CGI team behind Lord of the Rings, was also in charge of the effects for this movie. This brings me to the biggest flaw in this section of the movie, is that while the original only gave us a short amount of time with each creature confrontation, they did give us a lot of different creatures, and it did help the pace move along briskly. However, in this version, they give us fewer monsters, but they spend a lot more time on each monster. So I guess you can draw your own conclusion as to which you like better. Do you like longer and more intricate action scenes with fewer monsters, or shorter, simpler action scenes with a more diverse cast of monsters? For me, I choose the latter, but that's just me. I could see someone liking the other option better. And holy cow, I didn't talk about Anne yet. Naomi Watts plays Anne Darrow in this movie, and she is a great substitute for Fay Wray. She brings a lot more character and depth than Fay Wray did, and most of that comes through with her relationship with Kong. Her relationship with the other crew members is more or less the same as Fay Wray, but the way she interacts with Kong is more like an actual relationship than any of the other versions. In the original, she was always just terrified of Kong, of this monster, and Kong was somehow intrigued or infatuated with her, because, at least how I always took it, she was just so different from all the other women that he's seen on the island. And because she was such an anomaly, he wanted to keep her close to him as almost like a doll. In the 76 version, it's very sexual. Kong definitely wanted to get into Dwallen's pants. I don't know how that would even happen, but in this one, it's a lot more like a friendship. They have a mutual understanding. And I do like how they expanded Anne's character, aside from just being a pretty girl on the street, to a struggling vaudeville actress. And they use that to show that Anne entertains Kong with her vaudeville routines, mostly just falling down. But that is how they cultivate a relationship. And that is very cool, and I do appreciate that. But Kong, on the other hand, feels a lot more like a performance in this version than any other version. And maybe that's a testament or criticism of the technology used to make Kong. Now, it's no surprise that in this version, Kong is CGI, and they actually used Andy Serkis to motion capture for him. But the trade-off there is that Kong moves and looks and reacts a lot more like a human, which definitely humanizes him, but it also kind of takes away from the animalistic instinct that drove the other two versions. Again, going back to the original, Kong was such a naive ape, and in a lot of ways, Kong was a lot like a child. I mean, just look at that goofy expression. When he got to New York, he was in a world he didn't understand and he was lashing out. And you do kind of feel bad for him that he had to die in the end. With Kong in this version, his expressions are so human-like that there's not a whole lot to dig into. There's not a whole lot to question. Everything's right out there for you. Which brings me to the climax. And the climax here is a very faithful reproduction of the original climax. Kong scales the Empire State Building after rampaging through New York City, killing a bunch of people, ice skating with Andero for a bit too long. Like, when did this become Kong on ice? When did this become Bambi? I don't know, that scene is just weirdly out of place. They should have cut it. But anyway, he climbs the Empire State Building, the airplanes come, they shoot him down, he falls, he dies, everyone's sad. Beauty killed the Beast. But I have some mixed feelings about this climax because while it is, without a doubt, the best shot climax of any of these King Kong movies, and every time I watch it, I get such a sense of vertigo. And while I wouldn't call myself scared of heights, when you see Anne climbing that ladder and it breaks and she falls back, my heart does skip a beat every time. And you really do feel scared that at any moment, Kong or Anne are just gonna fall because they slipped. But that being said, when Kong actually dies, I felt nothing. And I always thought that was weird because the CGI model for Kong is so realistic, and the motion capture offers so much emotion and expression so that you can really feel Kong's pain. But I think it comes back to making Kong more like a human and less like an animal. And if you look at the other two versions, Kong is very animalistic, and when he dies, it's sad because you have this innocent animal that just died. Well, he did die for a good reason. He did tear apart New York after all. It is sad, and especially in the 76 version, it is sad that he died because it's animal cruelty. And animal cruelty is never fun to watch on screen. But in this version, he's so much more of a human that you don't really see it, or at least I didn't, as animal cruelty. You just see it as this guy who rampaged and they had to put him down. And for some reason, I don't know, maybe I'm weird like that, but I have less empathy when other humans die than when animals die. It's weird. Maybe you're like me and you feel the same way. But for some reason, when Kong dies in this version, I don't get as upset as in the 76 version. Now let's finally talk about what the heck they were talking about when they said Beauty killed the Beast. Because again, clearly it was the airplanes, but what do they mean? And here's my final conclusion on this line. It's bothered me for pretty much my entire life. And I think it goes back to the old Arabian proverb at the beginning of the original King Kong. This is not a real Arabian proverb. It's actually a fake. They just made it up for the movie. But it does have some strong themes that do play into every version of King Kong. And the prophet said, "And lo, the beast looked upon the face of beauty, and it stayed his hand from killing. And from that day, it was as one dead." Now, there's a lot that you can glean from this fake Arabian proverb, but for me and for the purposes of these movies, I think what it boils down to is when men or beasts fall in love with something beautiful, meaning a woman in this case, they'll be less inclined to kill or destroy, and instead turn that into a protective instinct of the thing that they love. And because of that, part of what makes them men dies. But I think for the purposes of King Kong and what it tried to set out to say is one, to draw parallels between men and their more aggressive, greedy, selfish sides, and Kong with this desire to kill and destroy. And the idea that a beautiful woman can change that instinct into something softer, and that ultimately being the demise of who they thought they were. In every other version, they get the whole Jack Driscoll thing completely wrong. But in the original, he was a woman hater, he was a hardened sea skipper, he had no desire for any of the finer things in life. But then he met Anne on the boat, he started caring about her, his protective instincts came out. Jack actually has tremendous growth in the original movie. He does overcome the urges of being a gorilla and actually finds new life and meaning and fulfillment in that. So when Denham says beauty killed the beast, beauty did kill the more beast-like sides of Jack's personality. So take from that what you will. I love King Kong. I've loved it since I was a kid. I honestly have a soft spot for all three of these versions, and while I would really only consider the original and the 2005 versions good movies and good adaptations of the original, the 1976 version I do have a soft spot for, mainly because it scarred me so much as a child. But hey, it did leave an impression, so you gotta give it credit for that. But now I want to encourage you to watch all three versions, come to a conclusion yourself, and let me know in the comments which one you think is your favorite. And if you want me to do another Kong video, I'm thinking about doing one about the spider pit sequence that was lost from the original, and how that scene would have played out, and some of the other creatures that didn't make it into the final cut. Be sure to give this video a like to know that you're interested. And also don't forget to hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. I'm going to be uploading every week now. I'm back on schedule. I'm moved in, ready to start this semester. Next video is coming out Friday, so be sure to hit that bell. And as always, I'm Colby. This was my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.